This story is titled, My Fiancée Left Me for My Brother on Our Wedding Day with My Parents' Full Support. Now she's trapped in a controlling marriage. They say the worst betrayals come from those you trust the most, but until it happens to you, until you're standing knee-deep in the wreckage of a life you thought was solid, you never truly understand what that means. Looking back, the signs had always been there, like cracks in the foundation of a house that only reveal their full extent when the whole structure comes crashing down. But love, real or imagined, has a way of making you blind to the truth, convincing you to ignore the things that should have sent you running in the opposite direction. 2 years ago, I was a man who had everything figured out. I was 35, in a stable career, and on the verge of marrying the woman I believed was my soulmate. Alexandra, Alex as I had always called her, was the kind of person who could walk into a room and make it feel brighter, someone who carried herself with an effortless charm that made people want to be around her. I had met her at a tech convention years earlier, where I was representing my company as a senior software developer, and she was there as a marketing executive. It had only taken a single conversation to realize that we spoke the same language, one of late-night debates about obscure science fiction, passionate discussions about the future of artificial intelligence, and a shared love for independent video games. We had talked for 6 hours that first night, so long that the restaurant staff had to nudge us toward the door as they prepared to close. For 5 years, I built my world around her, convincing myself that we were heading toward something solid, something permanent. Together, we had created a future that felt real. A home in a quiet Boston suburb, weekend road trips to the mountains, endless discussions about what we would name our kids. Even though we had always agreed, we weren't in a rush. I had never once questioned her loyalty, never doubted the sincerity in her voice when she told me she loved me. But there were things, small things, that I should have seen for what they were. There was the way she spoke to waiters at restaurants, never outright rude, but always laced with an air of superiority, as if she saw herself as someone who existed on a different plane than the people serving her. Then there were the lies, the little ones at first, easy to dismiss, easy to explain away. She would say she was out with friends when she was actually working late, or mention an old colleague in passing without revealing just how often they had been in contact. And there was something else, something more insidious, her uncanny ability to make everything about her. When I was going through a rough patch at work, struggling with a particularly difficult project, she had listened, nodded, and then somehow turned the conversation back to her frustrations, her stress, her problems. It was always like that. She never truly apologized when she hurt me. Instead, she found a way to justify it, to turn herself into the victim. But I had told myself that relationships required compromise, that no one was perfect, that love meant accepting the flaws along with the good. I should have also seen the warning signs in my family, in the dynamics that had shaped me long before Alex ever entered my life. My older brother, Nathan, had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. While I had taken a steady, respectable job in IT, Nathan had built his own tech empire, turning a small startup into a multi-million-dollar business by the time he was in his early 30s. My parents never hid their preference, never missed an opportunity to remind me of all the ways I fell short. Why can't you be more like Nathan? Was a question I had been hearing since I was old enough to understand what it meant to never quite measure up. I had spent years trying to carve out my own space, trying to prove that I was more than just Nathan's brother. But no matter what I did, no matter how much I achieved, he was always the one they held up as the standard. And Alex had noticed. She had seen the way my parents spoke about him, the way their eyes lit up when he shared stories about his latest business ventures. She had laughed at his jokes a little too enthusiastically, engaged him in conversations that seemed to last longer each time we visited my parents' house. I had chalked it up to admiration, to simple curiosity. After all, Nathan had a way of drawing people in, of making them feel important in his presence. But now, looking back, I wonder if it had started long before I had any reason to suspect. The night before the wedding, everything had seemed perfect. I had been staying at a hotel with my groomsmen, going over last-minute details, making sure everything was in place. Alex had texted me late that evening, a simple message. I can't wait to marry you tomorrow. I had read those words at least a dozen times, letting them settle deep into my bones, never once suspecting that within hours, my entire world would come undone. Then, an hour before the ceremony, my phone rang. Alex's voice was distant, detached, as if she were delivering a business decision rather than the single most devastating piece of news I had ever received. She said she couldn't go through with it, that she had been thinking about it for a while and realized she was making a mistake. And then, the part that made my blood turn to ice, she had been seeing someone else. Nathan. For months. And my parents had known. I had stood there, gripping the phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white, feeling the weight of it all crash down on me at once. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She hadn't even tried to soften the blow, hadn't given me some weak excuse or begged for my understanding. She had simply laid it out in front of me, as if expecting me to nod and accept it. When I arrived at the wedding venue, still in a daze, my mother had looked at me with something that might have been pity, but there was no real remorse in her voice when she said, "It's for the best. You wouldn't want to marry someone who doesn't truly love you," as if she hadn't known all along, as if she hadn't been complicit in the biggest betrayal of my life. And Nathan? He wasn't even there to face me. I had lost my fiancé, my family, and my dignity, all in the span of a single morning. And the worst part? None of them seemed to think they had done anything wrong. It's strange how a single moment can redefine everything you thought you knew about your life. How a single revelation can shatter not just your heart, but your sense of reality itself, leaving you standing in the wreckage of what used to be, unable to comprehend how it all crumbled so easily. I remember staring at my phone for what felt like an eternity, my mind refusing to accept the words I had just heard, my body frozen in place, as if moving would somehow make it all real, as if staying still could turn it into some kind of fever dream I would eventually wake up from. But there was no waking up, no rewinding time, no undoing what had already been set in motion. My fiancé had chosen my brother. My parents had known, and I was the last to find out, not because they couldn't tell me sooner, not because they hadn't had the opportunity, but because to them, my pain was secondary, an afterthought, something to be dealt with in the aftermath rather than considered beforehand. They hadn't even given me the courtesy of a warning, hadn't cared enough to prepare me for the humiliation of standing at the altar waiting for a woman who was never going to show up. Hadn't thought twice about letting me walk into that disaster blind, unprepared for the world, as I knew it to be ripped away from me in an instant. Somewhere in the haze of disbelief, I remember realizing that I was supposed to be leaving for the venue soon, that there were people waiting, guests arriving, a carefully planned ceremony unfolding without its main participant. My groomsmen stood in the hotel room with me, their faces shifting between concern and uncertainty, clearly unsure of what to say, how to react, what kind of support I needed when the situation was beyond anything any of us could have ever imagined. Someone, maybe my best friend, maybe my cousin, I couldn't even register who, suggested that we go anyway, that I at least make an appearance to explain, to prevent the kind of speculation that would undoubtedly follow if I simply disappeared without a word. And so, like a man walking to his own execution, I got into the car, my mind blank, my hands trembling, my chest tight with something that wasn't quite anger yet, wasn't quite sorrow, but something heavier, something worse, something that sat in the pit of my stomach like a stone that refused to move. The venue had been chosen with so much care, so much thought. A place Alex had fallen in love with the moment she saw it. A sprawling vineyard nestled against the mountains, with golden sunlight filtering through the leaves, and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers. It had been perfect, had felt like the kind of place where a new beginning could take root, where love could be celebrated in all its sincerity. But as I stepped out of the car that day, all I could see was a place that now meant nothing, a place that had once been a dream but had turned, in the space of a single phone call, into nothing more than a cruel joke. I don't know what I had expected when I walked in, sympathy, shock, even outrage on my behalf. But what I hadn't expected was the almost business-like efficiency with which my parents were already handling the situation. My mother, ever composed, was standing near the entrance, speaking in hushed tones to the wedding coordinator, making arrangements, smoothing things over as if this were nothing more than an inconvenient scheduling mishap rather than the complete destruction of her son's future. My father, arms crossed, had the kind of expression that suggested he had already moved on from whatever unpleasantness had transpired, that he was merely there to manage logistics, to ensure that no unnecessary drama unfolded. And when my mother turned to me, her eyes scanning my face as if assessing how much of a scene I was about to make, her words weren't of comfort, weren't of apology, weren't of regret. She told me, in that quiet, matter-of-fact way of hers, that I wouldn't want to marry someone who didn't truly love me, that it was better this way, that Alex had only realized the truth a little later than she should have, as if I should be grateful, as if this was a favor, as if the humiliation of being left on my wedding day was something to be thankful for rather than something that would brand itself into my memory, leaving a scar I would carry for the rest of my life. And in that moment, something inside me broke. Not in the loud, dramatic way people imagine heartbreak to be. Not in the way that leads to shouting or pleading or desperate bargaining. No, this was something quieter, something colder, a kind of severing that happened in the silence between her words, in the realization that I had never really mattered to them the way I had wanted to, the way I had spent my entire life trying to. I asked where Nathan was, though I already knew the answer. He hadn't come, hadn't faced me, hadn't even had the decency to be present for the fallout of what he had done. And maybe that was the most telling part of it all. Not just the betrayal itself, but the complete lack of accountability. The way he had taken everything from me and hadn't even bothered to look me in the eye while doing it. The guests had been told something vague, something about unforeseen circumstances, something to send them away without too many questions. I didn't stay to find out exactly how it was worded. I didn't stay at all. I turned around, walked back to the car, ignored the voices calling after me, ignored the weight of my mother's sigh, ignored the way my father didn't even try to stop me. I drove until the vineyard disappeared behind me, until the mountains faded into the distance, until the carefully curated life I had built with Alex felt like something that had happened to someone else, in another world, in another lifetime. And when I finally stopped, when I finally pulled over on the side of some unfamiliar road, staring at a horizon that looked just as empty as I felt, I realized something else, something almost worse than the betrayal itself. I had nowhere to go. The home I had bought, the future I had built, the people who were supposed to be my family, it was all gone, and I was completely, utterly alone. In the days that followed, I existed in a strange limbo, caught somewhere between the raw sting of betrayal and the numb, drifting sensation of a life that no longer felt like my own. The world kept moving, as it always does, indifferent to the wreckage left in its wake, and yet I felt utterly frozen, as if I had stepped outside of time itself, watching the pieces of my former life scatter like ashes in the wind. I had never known what it meant to feel truly untethered before, to wake up in the morning without a single point of reference, without a direction, without a reason to put one foot in front of the other, beyond the simple necessity of keeping my body moving. The house I had once imagined filling with memories now felt hollow, stripped of the warmth it once held, each room echoing with the absence of the future I had so carefully constructed in my mind. The silence was the worst part, not just the quiet that settled in the air, but the realization that for the first time in my life, I had no one to turn to, no safe harbor, no sense of belonging. I had spent years believing that love, once solidified, was something unshakable, something that, despite its inevitable challenges, could not be so easily discarded. And yet, Alex had left without hesitation, had severed the ties between us with the clean precision of a surgeon's blade, without second guessing and without remorse. And my family, the very people who should have been my foundation, had not only condoned it, but had stood by, unaffected, as if my pain was little more than an unfortunate inconvenience, a minor side effect of a decision that had already been made long before I was given the courtesy of knowing. It was impossible not to replay the past, to comb through the years I had spent with Alex, searching for the moment where it had all begun to unravel, for the first fracture in the foundation, for the misstep that had sent everything tumbling down. Had it been there from the start, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge? Had I been too blinded by love, too eager to believe in the future I wanted so desperately, to see what had been in front of me all along? I wanted to hate her, wanted to conjure the kind of rage that would make it easier to move on, but all I could feel was an empty, aching hollowness, as if I had been gutted from the inside, as if the best parts of me had been extracted, leaving only the remnants of a man who had once believed in something that was never real to begin with. Work became my refuge, the only place where I could at least pretend that I was still the same person I had been before my world had been set on fire. I buried myself in projects, stayed late at the office long after my coworkers had gone home, let the relentless logic of coding and problem-solving become the only thing that mattered, the only thing that still made sense. Numbers were predictable. Algorithms followed rules. Computers did not betray you. There was a strange sort of comfort in that, in the control it offered, in the way it allowed me to shut out everything else. My colleagues were careful around me, offering sympathy with hesitant glances, avoiding the subject unless I brought it up, which I never did. I couldn't bear to hear their pity, to see the way they looked at me as if I were something broken, something fragile, something to be handled with caution. Outside of work, I kept to myself, declining invitations, ignoring messages, letting friendships quietly fade as I withdrew further into my own isolation. The idea of socializing, of engaging in casual conversations while pretending that I wasn't unraveling inside, felt exhausting, unbearable even. I told myself that solitude was what I needed, that it was the only way to heal, but in truth, I wasn't sure if I was healing at all. It felt more like I was drifting, waiting for something, though I had no idea what. And then, as if the universe had not taken enough from me, Alex reappeared, slipping back into my life like a shadow creeping in under the door, uninvited, unwanted, but impossible to ignore. It started with a message, one I almost didn't open, her name flashing across my screen like some ghost from a past life. I should have deleted it without reading, should have let it vanish into the void without giving it a second thought, but some part of me, whether out of morbid curiosity or sheer masochism, clicked on it before I could stop myself. She wrote that she was sorry, that she had never meant to hurt me, that she had been confused, that she had followed what she thought was love, only to find herself lost in something she hadn't fully understood. She said that things with Nathan weren't what she expected, that he wasn't who she thought he was, that she missed me, that she hoped, in time, I could find it in my heart to forgive her. The words felt hollow, meaningless, a feeble attempt to rewrite history, to soften the sharp edges of what she had done, to absolve herself of guilt without truly taking responsibility. I didn't reply, I didn't need to. She had made her choice. And for the first time since she had walked away, I finally understood that I was no longer standing at the edge of something broken. I was standing at the beginning of something new. I didn't know what that future looked like yet, didn't know how long it would take to truly rebuild. But I knew one thing for certain, it would not include her. And as I sat there, staring at the message that would never receive an answer, I felt something shift inside me. Small, almost imperceptible, but real. Maybe, just maybe, I was finally starting to let go. Update. It's strange how, just when you think you've put the past behind you, when you've done the work to pull yourself out of the wreckage and start rebuilding, it finds a way to creep back in, slipping through the cracks in moments you least expect. I thought I had reached a place where I no longer needed answers, where I no longer cared to dissect every painful moment, where I had finally accepted that closure was something I would have to give myself. And for a while, that belief felt real. Then, out of nowhere, Alex reached out again. I hadn't responded to her first message, the one where she offered some hollow apology, wrapped in self-pity, a feeble attempt to paint herself as a confused woman who had simply followed her heart, as if that justified the destruction she had left in her wake. I had let that message sit there, unanswered, a ghost of a conversation that would never happen. But this time, something was different. Her words were desperate. She said she had made a mistake, that things with Nathan weren't what she had imagined, that she had fallen for the idea of him, the success, the confidence, the image of a man who had the world at his feet, but had realized, far too late, that beneath it all, he was not the person she thought he was. She said he was cold, controlling, a man who saw her as an accessory rather than a partner, someone who valued appearances over substance, who had swept her into his world only to treat her like something to be owned rather than loved. And then, the part that almost made me laugh in disbelief, she said she missed me, as if those words could erase the past, as if saying them could somehow rewind time, undo everything that had been broken, turn back the clock to a version of us that no longer existed. But it wasn't just Alex who resurfaced. A few days after her message, my mother called. The first time, I let it go to voicemail, not ready to hear whatever justification or half-hearted olive branch she was prepared to extend. The second time, I almost ignored it again, but something in me, curiosity, anger, maybe just the need to finally hear it for myself, made me pick up. She acted as though no time had passed, as though the months of silence between us had been nothing more than a minor pause in our relationship, rather than the result of an unforgivable betrayal. She said she had been thinking about me, that she hoped I was doing well, and then, without hesitation, she slipped into the real reason for her call. Nathan and Alex were falling apart. The perfect couple, the ones she had stood by, the ones she had chosen over me, were unraveling. My mother spoke carefully, as if she were testing the waters, gauging whether there was room for sympathy, for reconciliation, for a return to the family she had so easily cast me out of when it suited her. She said that things hadn't worked out the way everyone had hoped, that Nathan was under a lot of stress, that Alex was struggling, that perhaps, in time, I could understand that mistakes were made, but that family was still family. I couldn't stop myself from laughing. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even bitterness. It was something colder, something quieter, a realization so sharp and sudden that it almost felt like relief. They had expected me to be waiting. They had thought that, after everything, I would still be standing at the edge of their lives, hoping for an invitation back in, eager to forgive, desperate to belong. They had assumed that my absence had been temporary, that I was simply waiting for the right moment to come home, to let the past be swept under the rug like every other uncomfortable truth they had chosen to ignore. But I wasn't that person anymore, so I told my mother the truth. I told her that I had spent too many years measuring my worth by their approval, by their affection, by the scraps of validation they occasionally threw my way. I told her that I had spent my entire life being the afterthought, the backup plan, the son who was never quite enough. And then I told her that I was done. I was done waiting, done hoping, done pretending that there was anything left to salvage. And as I hung up the phone, as I sat in the quiet of my apartment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. For the first time, I wasn't the one being left behind. I was the one walking away. There's a moment, after you've burned the last remaining bridges to a past that no longer serves you, when you expect to feel a crushing sense of loss, a kind of existential loneliness that reminds you of all the things you've left behind. But when I finally stepped away from my family, when I let go of the last lingering threads of obligation, expectation, and misplaced hope, what I felt instead was an overwhelming quiet, one that was not suffocating or oppressive, but strangely light, like an exhale I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. It was the kind of quiet that comes when a storm has passed, not because the world has returned to the way it was before, but because something fundamental has shifted, leaving behind a landscape that is forever changed, stripped bare, yet open to the possibility of something new. For so long, I had believed that rebuilding meant finding a way back to what I had lost, that healing was a process of restoration rather than reinvention, that the goal was not to become someone new, but to piece together the remnants of the person I had once been. But standing at the edge of this new reality, with nothing tethering me to the past, I began to understand that there was no going back, no version of myself that could exist in the shadow of what had been taken from me. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of that. Work had become a sanctuary of sorts, a space where I could define myself outside of my history, outside of the expectations that had weighed me down for so long. I had always been good at what I did, always found comfort in the predictability of code, in the logical flow of problem solving, in the way technology offered a kind of control that human relationships never could. But now it was more than just a job. It was a place where I could build something on my own terms, where success wasn't measured against anyone else, where I wasn't in competition with a brother who had always overshadowed me or seeking validation from parents who would never give it freely. And then, somewhere in the midst of this quiet transformation, something unexpected happened. I started living again, not just existing, not just moving through the motions of a life that felt like a placeholder for something better, but actually living, making choices that weren't rooted in obligation or habit, allowing myself to explore the things I had once loved but had long neglected, reaching out to people I had pushed away in the aftermath of my heartbreak. I reconnected with old friends, not because I needed their sympathy or their reassurances, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be part of something that wasn't tainted by betrayal. I started saying yes to things I would have once avoided, not grand, sweeping gestures, but small, meaningful choices. A spontaneous weekend trip to the coast, a long overdue hike through the mountains, an unfamiliar restaurant where I ordered something I couldn't even pronounce. It was as if, after years of living within the narrow parameters of a life that had been shaped by others, I was finally giving myself permission to expand beyond those invisible borders, to step outside the carefully curated existence that had once felt so safe, so predictable, but had ultimately proven to be nothing more than an illusion. It wasn't about forgetting. I knew there would always be echoes of what had happened, that certain places, certain songs, certain passing thoughts would still carry the weight of what I had lost. Healing wasn't a straight line, and I had come to accept that some wounds don't ever fully disappear. They simply become part of you, woven into the fabric of who you are, reshaping you in ways you never anticipated. But instead of letting those wounds define me, I was learning to see them as proof of survival, as evidence that I had endured, that I had walked through fire and come out the other side not unscathed, but stronger, more certain of who I was, and more unwilling than ever to settle for anything less than what I deserved. And then, just as I had begun to feel truly free, just as I had started to believe that the past had finally loosened its grip on me, something, or rather, someone, entered my life in a way I never could have anticipated. I met her on an ordinary afternoon, at a cafe I had never been to before, a place I had chosen on a whim simply because I had been in the mood for something different. She wasn't someone I had been looking for, not someone I had even considered wanting, because for so long I had convinced myself that I wasn't ready, that love, if it ever found its way back to me, was something that would happen far in the distant future, after I'd finished healing, after I had rebuilt myself into someone who could trust again. But life has a way of surprising you, of slipping something beautiful into the spaces you never realized were waiting to be filled. And before I even understood what was happening, she was there. She was nothing like Alex. Where Alex had been calculated and poised, always aware of how she was perceived, always curating the perfect version of herself for the world to see, this woman was effortlessly genuine, her presence unguarded in a way that made me forget, if only for a moment, how much I had once feared vulnerability. She had a way of speaking that made even the simplest conversation feel important, a quiet kind of confidence that didn't demand attention but commanded it all the same. There was no pretense, no carefully rehearsed charm, no sense that she was anything other than exactly who she was, and in a way I couldn't quite explain. That was what drew me in. I didn't fall for her instantly. I wasn't ready for that, and maybe she wasn't either. But there was something there, something undeniable, something that made me want to know her. Not because I needed to fill the void Alex had left behind, but because, for the first time in a long time, I wanted to move forward, not as a man trying to escape his past, but as someone finally ready to embrace the future. And so, slowly, cautiously, I let myself take that first step. Not toward her necessarily, not toward anything specific, just forward. Because for the first time, I wasn't looking back. Update 2. There's a strange, almost imperceptible shift that happens when you finally decide to stop measuring your life by what you've lost. When you stop defining yourself by the people who hurt you, the betrayals that broke you, the dreams that never came to be. It doesn't happen all at once. There's no single moment where the past suddenly loses its grip, no grand revelation that erases the pain overnight. But slowly, in the quiet spaces between old wounds and new beginnings, you realize that you are no longer carrying the same weight, that the burden of memory no longer presses quite so heavily against your chest, that you are, for the first time in longer than you can remember, moving through the world without the constant ache of what might have been. I had spent so much time convinced that healing meant finding a way to erase the past, that moving forward required some kind of forgetting, as if the only way to truly be free was to make it so that none of it had ever happened. But life, as it turns out, doesn't work that way. You don't forget. You don't wake up one morning and find that the past has dissolved like mist under the morning sun. Instead, you learn to carry it differently. You learn that the weight of memory doesn't have to be an anchor, that it doesn't have to keep you tethered to the wreckage of what was, that it can be something else entirely, a reminder of where you've been, a testament to what you've survived, a quiet acknowledgement of the person you once were and the person you have become. And so, as I stood on the edge of something new, staring into the unknown with a kind of anticipation I hadn't felt in years, I let myself embrace the idea that the past would always be a part of me, but it would not define me. I let go of the need for retribution, the desire for closure that would never come, the belief that I needed an apology or an explanation or some kind of validation to move on. The truth was, I didn't need any of it. The only thing I needed was this moment, this breath, this quiet certainty that I was finally free. There were still remnants of the old wounds, of course, shadows that lingered in certain places, in certain thoughts, in certain fleeting moments when I caught a glimpse of a memory I hadn't expected to resurface. But they no longer had the same power over me. They no longer pulled me under. They no longer defined the shape of my days. Instead, my life had begun to take on a new shape, one that felt less like a desperate attempt to rebuild what had been broken and more like the creation of something entirely different, something that was mine in a way nothing had ever been before. My work, once an escape, had become something I genuinely loved again, no longer a refuge from my pain, but a space where I could challenge myself, push myself, grow in ways I had never prioritized before. My friendships, strained in the aftermath of my downfall, had slowly begun to mend, strengthened by the understanding that real connection wasn't about showing up only in the good times, but in the moments when everything felt impossible. And then, of course, there was her. She had come into my life so quietly, so unexpectedly, that for a long time I hadn't even realized what was happening, hadn't recognized the way something was shifting inside me, hadn't acknowledged that for the first time in years, I wasn't just existing, I was feeling again. It wasn't the all-consuming, blinding kind of love that takes over your world in an instant, nor was it the reckless abandon of something built on need rather than choice. It was slow, steady, something that grew in the spaces between laughter and conversation, in the way she challenged me without ever making me feel small, in the way she listened, not just to my words, but to the silences in between. And maybe that was the biggest difference. With Alex, love had always felt like something I had to prove, something I had to earn, something that came with conditions and expectations and the unspoken pressure to be enough. But with her, it was effortless. There was no proving, no striving, no sense that I needed to be anything other than exactly who I was. For the first time, I understood what love was supposed to feel like. And so, as I stood at the threshold of this new chapter, as I looked ahead at a future that was entirely unwritten, I allowed myself to embrace the simple, undeniable truth that had taken me so long to accept. I had survived. I had let go. I had found something worth moving forward for, not in spite of the past, but because of it. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what came next, because whatever it was mine.